Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited for my version 2.0 big board to come out here on the channel. Of course, we have had some players decide to go back to college, like Yaxel Lendeberg, for example, of course, Boogie Fland as well a couple of weeks ago. So I figured now was a great time to share version 2.0 of my 2025 NBA Draft Big Board. In this video, there will be 33 prospects we talk about. I was just going to do my top 30, but there were 3 guys I wanted to include as well in that. And there is a bit of a shakeup since the last Big Board video I recorded. There has been some shifting, especially in that 20 to 30 range. Of course, a lot of those prospects are very bunched up. So this video will have some different prospects in different places. I hope you guys do enjoy all of the hard work I put into the content here year-round when it comes to NBA draft coverage, and I really appreciate you guys. So make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you are new or newer. Maybe you haven't subscribed quite yet, but I hope I can win you over with today's video. And just a little bit of a breakdown on how I do my big board. It is quite a bit different, so we will spend a minute or two here to explain it. I have a variety of levels. I like a very graphic board, one that showcases the actual thought process I have put behind these prospects in my evaluation. In years past, going back to, say, the 2021-2022 draft, for example, I just felt like the generic rankings, the tiers, it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of the visual appeal and really explaining how I feel about each prospect individually. So my board is quite a bit different, but it is pretty simple to understand. These bars here on the right side, as you can see, have a projected floor and a projected ceiling, and they all kind of play into certain tiers, right? So for example, my number one player in the draft here is player Y from school Y. That number one player, I think, has a very high ceiling. In fact, all NBA ceiling, as you can see here, but probably falls somewhere in the middle, right? It kind of depends on each prospect where I actually think they're going to end up. And then the projected floor is at minimum a starter, and that would be this hypothetical number one player in the draft in just this example. I have a variety of tiers and levels: G League, fringe roster spot, end of bench, depth piece, role player starter, quality starter, all-star, all-NBA, Hall of Famer, all-timer, and of course, greatest of all time. The point of these levels is to kind of best showcase what I think this prospect is. There's a variety of ways of doing it. You can look at, okay, well, do you have a lottery grade on him? Do you have a first-round grade? This, that, or the other thing. But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where a player gets drafted. It more so matters what they turn into in their career. And I think these tiers are super useful for that. So if you guys do have any questions about the board in general, make sure to comment that down below. I'll try and be thorough and explain it as we go. I hope everything is as clear and concise as possible. But let's jump into it here now with that 33 through 30 range. These are guys who maybe could be 5th starters in their career, or maybe a little bit worse than that, like top 8 rotation guys. A pretty safe bet for some of these players. Joan, Beringer, first guy I want to talk about. Now, I do have a little bit of starter potential there, and his potential does fall down into the depth piece category, a little bit below that even. And I think for Beringer specifically, he is lacking in some skill areas when it comes to being efficient without others creating for him, and I think some of his offense is going to be very reliant on guard creation and on-ball creation from other players, but that's not atypical for rim-running bigs specifically, and that's what Beringer really projects to be in the NBA. And for me specifically, what gives him some possible starter upside, but mostly rotation player upside, is the value he provides as a rim protector. He's been just tremendous for Cedevita Olympia in his minutes as a shot blocker and a real rim presence for them. And I think that has solidified him for me as a top 35-ish prospect. Now, there are a few players on this list that I kind of in between, back and forth, kind of, again, in this 25 to 35 range. It's very, very tight for me with some of these prospects, especially as some guys decide to go back to school. I think the draft class is a bit suppressed this year, after number 35 roughly. So that 25 to 35 range I think is really important. There's still going to be some tweaks I make down the stretch of this process. 32, I do have Nolan Traore. He falls a couple spots between my last big board and now. But as you can tell, I do have him as a probable rotation guard. He has very respectable positional size. And one of the things I love about him is his commitment to getting downhill and getting to the rim. He's got a very good quick first step. He's able to get where he wants to go pretty frequently. Now, some of that stems from the way teams guard him, especially over there in France, with the way teams are going under screens pretty aggressively against him, daring him to shoot. And his true shooting percentage this year and his overall efficiency as a scorer, and most specifically as a shooter off the dribble, just hasn't been good enough. And that's really where I continue to struggle with where I want to actually put him. I have him at 32 right now because while I do think the size is valuable, the playmaking feel is quite good, especially when he's utilizing a roller, utilizing the dunker spot as a passer. There is some real value there to uncover. And I do think if Traore lands in the right situation, he can be a very high-level backup point guard. I just am unsure if the actual shot diet and the scoring creation is going to be good enough to warrant him having the ball in his hands as frequently as he has for St. Quentin. So I think all things considered here for Nolan Traore at number 32, I do think there is value. Defensively, he's got a long way to go to being an actual good NBA player, but there's size and there's some skill to work with, and I think that's going to be the beginning framework for whatever team drafts and develops him moving forward. Number 31, I have Maxime Raynaud, someone who I do think very likely will be a first-round pick in the 2025 NBA draft. I have him at 31 myself. I do think there are some limitations in terms of his actual rim protection caliber, and as just an older prospect. We see this all the time, especially with big men. Older big men prospects typically put together great college seasons, and then they get to the league and they kind of just become a run-of-the-mill backup big man. And I think for Maxime Raynaud, there are some special qualities that will separate him from that tier because of his mobility, his sheer height, length, measured in pretty well at the combine, and then of course stretched his game out to the three-point line quite a bit more this past season. Now, when it comes to his NBA career, is he going to be a good enough rim protector? Is he going to be a good enough defender to anchor a defense? And I think that's going to be a real challenge. Center is the most important position when it comes to regular season basketball in the NBA because it really cements how good your team defense can be at times. Now, obviously, team context is important here, right? Like some teams, if you have a plethora of good point of attack defenders, you can make a suboptimal rim protector work quite well. And vice versa. Sometimes an elite rim protector can maximize sub-optimal point of attack defenders. So I think Maxime Raynaud, obviously, context specific will be important for him. If he lands on a team that has a collection of good on-ball defenders already who are going to be able to ride hips, challenge around the rim, and force opponents into tough shots, Raynaud is definitely serviceable. And then obviously you're going to uncover a good amount of offensive upside with him moving forward. So there's a lot to work with there. I do think the expansion of his game offensively was quite important for his development this year. And I do think if you're trying to project him going into the NBA, that stretch component is going to be a super valuable aspect to it, as well as his transition finishing as a big man, whether you view him as a trail big or if you see him running the floor, getting out ahead of the action a bit with his foot speed. So I do think there's quite a bit of value there to uncover yet for a team. Number 30, I have Thomas Sorber. He was not in my top 30 in my most recent big board. Moves up a couple of spots. Now, admittedly, in my last big board, I only did a top 30. He was probably like 31 or 32. So it wasn't really that big of an omission. He hasn't really slid up a ton of spots here. And I think Thomas Sorber is one of the most interesting prospects to talk about in this year's draft. I have him at number 30 on my big board right now with real starter potential to play into, as you can see. There's significant potential here for him to grow into and actually be able to play and be a starting caliber player, as you can see where my mouse has his starter potential. But I also see some potential for him to be maybe just a depth piece, maybe even just a little bit worse than that. And the reason for that is, while yes, there's some skill to work with and there's definitely some intrigue right with his game when it comes to the passing, the finishing, playing out of the face-up game in the mid-post, there is some emerging talent to work with. The question for me is that talent good enough to be sustainable NBA offense? Because right now, shot 16% from three this past year for Georgetown. The volume wasn't very respectable. The mid-range jump shot, while at times flashed pretty well, I don't think that's going to be a super reliable go-to shot for him in the NBA. And I think, yes, while the maximized value of Thomas Sorber offensively is probably playing out of the short roll, utilizing his passing, there is value for that. I also don't want to overlook the fact that he measured in at just 6'9" without shoes on, with a 9'1" standing reach as a predominantly drop coverage big man. This is something that I think is kind of completely overlooked because he measured him with an elite wingspan at 7'6". I think everyone has overlooked the standing reach. He has a shorter standing reach than Derik Queen. Everyone seems to be fretting over Derik Queen's position in the NBA. Is he a tweener big? Is he a 4? Is he a 5? And yet he has a bigger standing reach than Thomas Sorber, who projects pretty much to only be a 5. So I think that's a really interesting polarity in this draft class where I think people are overreacting positively to the wingspan and not looking at his overall height and standing reach and how that's going to be a limiting factor for him as a drop coverage big man. Now, the rim protection numbers were great. At Georgetown, had over a 7% block rate. The rim defensive field goal percentage was quite good. The paint defensive field goal percentage was very, very, very good with him on the court. And Georgetown was just, quite frankly, a whole lot better with Sorber on the court defensively than they were without him on the floor. So the defensive impact is still something that if you're going to bet on, which is why I do have some starter upside here for him, that's where the value is going to be. Now, I think best case scenario, he lands on a team that already has some significant offensive creation around him. A couple of examples that come to mind for me are Atlanta with Trae Young, maybe the Clippers with James Harden and Kawhi Leonard. There's a few teams kind of in that 20s range. I could see Orlando with their collection of defensive talent maximizing his defensive impact a bit too because of how many good point of attack defenders they have. Sorber could come in and clean things up on the back end quite well too. So there's a good amount of value here for Sorber depending on where he lands, but I do think the offense is going to be my big question mark. I do think the touch is somewhat questionable. There were some moments where the focus would lapse on finishes that he should have just made. I think there's a real growth area here for him where if he does develop and grow his offensive game, he can return much better value than number 30 in the draft. I'm just a little hesitant on how well he's going to be able to uncover and reach that potential, all things considered. Number 29, I have Will Riley, moves up a spot from my most recent big board, and I do think there is a good sense of confidence and belief around this kid. Measured in quite well at the combine, over 6'8" without shoes on, and has very respectable length to him and an emerging offensive skill set. He is a dribble pass shoot prospect as a wing, and that's what really excites I think a lot of people about Will Riley. And you guys know I'm big on the dribble pass shoot. Now the problem for me here with Will Riley, I think the dribble pass shoot is a little bit more theoretical than it is actual at this point in time. The shot diet, I think, is standard for what an NBA wing shot diet will look like in terms of catching, attacking closeouts, taking pull-up jump shots, and knocking down open three-point shots. Those are things Will Riley, I'm very confident, is going to be able to do. The question, though, is how does he stand out compared to other NBA wings then if that's the case? And then also he is quite slim at this point in time, and I think that's going to be a limiting factor early in his career. Of course, you get him into a weight strength conditioning program in the NBA, there's a good chance he bulks up a little bit, gets a bit stronger, gets a bit more functionally athletic as well when it comes to playing into traffic, playing into contact especially. But Will Riley at number 29 for me, I do think, again, you're kind of banking on that offensive scoring upside, the ability to put the ball on the deck, create for himself, and then when he does draw a second defender, he's got very solid size. He can pass the ball quite well. There was a lot of moments this past year for Illinois where he'd drive the basketball baseline, spray it out to the opposite side corner, start a ball reversal. Not everything turns into an assist, and that's okay. You don't really need assists to grade playmaking, and I think Will Riley has a very strong base level for his playmaking talent. Now, I do think it's a quite strong draft class, which is why I have him at 29 here. But as you can see, I still think he's returning some starter potential and very safe rotation player potential in this year's draft. Number 28, I have Labaron Philon. I think one of the things that has me very optimistic about him, there's really two elements. It's his handle, the ability to get downhill consistently. He's got some interesting deceleration skills to work with. And then defensively, his event creation rate for Alabama, a team that was very, very bad defensively. They typically are, as a high-paced, pro-styled offense. They get up and down the court very well, but at times can allow other teams to do that to them too. And I think Labaron Philon was one of the strongest defenders for Alabama this past year. Used him at the point of attack quite a bit. He was quite strong through screen navigation and had active hands guarding the basketball. A good number of pickpockets this year. His steal rate was pretty impressive, posting over a 2% steal rate, which I thought was pretty darn good. All things considered there with the defensive context around him at Alabama, of course, playing next to Mark Sears, Grant Nelson, Clifford Morey. There are some okay to good players in that grouping, but none of them are elite defenders by any stretch. So I do think Labaron Philon stood out in a big way for Alabama when it came to guarding the basketball. And then I think there's just the little nuances of the game that he does well in, whether it's playing in transition. I think there's some similarities to Christian Braun, who's one of the best transition players in the NBA now. Of course, playing for Denver and around Nikola Jokic helps with that. But Christian Braun has a lot of great just skills that make him a great transition player. And Labaron Philon has similar qualities to him when it comes to downhill force. Now, I don't think he's going to finish above the rim nearly as well as Christian Braun does, but I do think the finger rolls, the Euro steps in transition, all of those things should play quite well at the NBA level when he is in situations to get out ahead of the pack or play 2-on-1 basketball, which probably won't happen too frequently for him, and that's where some of the concerns for me come. In the half-court offense, how reliable is he? Are you going to really put the ball in his hands to be a creator? Because I think that's maybe the best realized version of his offensive game, but I don't think that's the best realized version for his team. So that's kind of the big question for me, but I still value him enough to have him in the top 30 here in this year's draft class. 27, I have Liam McNeeley. He does move down a few spots in this big board. The more I think about it, the less I love Liam McNeeley as a prospect. He just kind of screams fifth starter / bench shooter to me. And it really stems from his foot speed. Even if you look at a guy like Corey Kispert, who I think most people would say, well, that's not a terrible comparison for Liam McNeeley. I think Corey Kispert has quite better foot speed than McNeeley. And while, yes, McNeeley had some challenges that he had to overcome this year at UConn in terms of who was creating for him, this, that, and the other thing, I do think flat out it's a very safe bet that Liam McNeeley is going to be a good shooter in the NBA. I think he'll shoot the ball well, and I think that gets him on the court enough. The question for me is, can he guard threes in the NBA? That's going to be a challenge, because if he can guard threes, then his rebounding value at that position is quite a bit more valuable. If he's playing as the 4, he's just kind of a standard rebounding 4 then, in terms of the value he's going to add there. He's not going to get on the glass more often than most other 4s. So I do think if you can play him at the 3, if he can guard other small 4s, that's going to be huge for him, but I do have questions about his lateral mobility. And I do think the offensive shooting, while he can shoot the ball well, he's not one of these movement shooters you're going to run off of staggers and wide pins, and you're not going to probably use him as a ghost screener 8 times a game. I think he's more of a stationary spot-up catch-and-shoot guy, which makes him, I think, significantly less dynamic in the half-court as well compared to other shooters in this year's draft class, which we'll talk about later in this video as we get a little bit higher up on the board. 26, I have Egor Demin. This is going to be one of the hot-button topics, but for me with Egor Demin, you're going to see here, I have his ceiling relatively high. I mean, higher than the majority in this 23 to 33 bunching. But I also have his floor quite low as a player who I could see not being a quality player in the NBA. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around Egor Demin as a prospect. This is not a point guard. Egor Demin is not a point guard at all. He cannot dribble the basketball. He cannot create advantage. He cannot win out of isolation. And your best bet is putting him in ball screens. But the question is, what team is he better at running ball screens for than their current existing point guard? The answer is not very many. Like if he went to Brooklyn, for example, he's not better than Cam Thomas. So why would he have the ball over Cam Thomas? It just doesn't make that much sense for a team to draft him in the top 10. And it really doesn't make a lot of sense for a team to put the ball in his hands a ton. I think the best realized version of Egor Demin, and this is where the potential lies for me, if Egor Demin is going to work in the NBA, it will be as a point forward who can push in transition, initiate early offense, maybe screen and dive, play out of the short roll a bit, maybe use him as a ghost screener, and then he needs significant three-point shooting progression. Shot sub 30% from 3 this past year for BYU, was honestly abysmal in Big 12 play for the Cougars, and I do think all things considered here for BYU, while Egor Demin had some significant flashes that did showcase maybe some top 10 potential in this year's draft, a lot of that came against lesser competition, and once the going got tough, Egor Demin barely got going, and I think that's going to be one of the big concerns for me just going into his NBA career. It's not getting easier when you play against NBA guys, whether it's going to be foot speed, where if he's getting guarded by smaller point guards, they're all going to be able to cut him off. I don't think his handle is dynamic enough to create downhill and to really leverage his size at the quote-unquote position he'll play. And then when it comes to playing against wings, he's very, very contact averse. He doesn't like playing into traffic too much. And again, he doesn't get downhill enough to warrant some of the other playmaking. Like if you want to view him as this elite drive and kick upside prospect, Well, he has to get the drive part down first, and I don't think he's going to be dynamic enough with the ball in his hands to really leverage that enough. I do think if you're viewing him in the context of, hey, can he cut, be connective, play off the ball, use his size in other ways without the basketball in his hands predominantly, that's where the value really lies, which is what still has him in the top 30 here on my big board. But if I'm being completely honest with you, he's not warranting a top 15, top 20 pick in this year's draft because of some of those limitations, and a lot of it stems from his inability to handle the basketball against traffic, against ball pressure, and how often he picks the ball up early when faced with any kind of ball contained. So I do think there's a lot of problems with the Egor Demin, which is what puts the next three guys ahead of him on my board. You look at Mark Sears, Walter Clayton Jr., Ben Saraf. I do think they're all limited in some ways, and that's what gives Egor Demin a little bit of a higher ceiling probably long term, because he's just flat out bigger, longer, taller. But these guys are better basketball players than he is right now, especially. Mark Sears, I think one of the most underrated players in this year's draft class. He had a down year at Alabama. I will fully admit that. He did not shoot the ball nearly as well as he did a year ago or for his entire college career. At the end of the day, though, he did take some meaningful playmaking strides, averaged over 5 assists per game for the first time in his college career, playing in the SEC, being the primary go-to initiator for an Alabama team that, honestly, I don't think had a ton of offensive talent. You know, I mentioned Clifford Morey, mentioned Grant Nelson. I think Grant Nelson's a solid fit next to Mark Sears. I don't think Clifford Morey ever was. If you go back to the way he was playing before transferring to Alabama, he was predominantly a back-to-the-basket big who couldn't stay on the court for longer than 8 minutes at a time because he'd get too tired. Like, Alabama had some significant roster limitations around Sears, in my opinion, when it came to actually scoring the basketball. And I think it tasked Sears in a way that once he gets to the NBA, he's not going to have that heavy load of creating all of his team's offense at the level and rate that he did this past year for the Crimson Tide. And I think if you view him in the lens of, hey, can he be a backup point guard? Can he be a top 8 role player, kind of like I have him listed as here? I think that's very achievable. And then you look at someone like Walter Clayton Jr. too. Walter Clayton Jr. had his breakout season this past year for Florida as they went on to win a national title. Of course, a lot of things went very, very well for the Gators this year. And Walter Clayton Jr. was the headliner there. I think with his ability to create off the bounce, this is a player who definitely deserves some top 30 love in this year's draft class. Especially as some players withdraw their names, pull out of the draft class. Walter Clayton Jr. for me, after going back to the film more and more and more, I do think there's at least some respectable starting potential here, and at worst case, some off-the-bench juice that he can bring to a team. Now, it is important to note that I think the NBA is shifting away from those off-the-bench go-to creators, the Jamal Crawfords, the Lou Williams of the world. That's a dying archetype in the NBA because it's not the most efficient play style, and teams are doing a better job staggering their actual starters. If your team has 2 or 3 really good players, you're going to have 1 or 2 of them on the court at all times. So a player archetype like Walter Clayton Jr. maybe loses a little bit of value now compared to, say, the year 2010, but I do think Walter Clayton Jr. has the ability to stay on the court because of his three-point attempt rate, the ability to shoot the 3 ball, something that if you're trying to make a bet here between Walter Clayton Jr. and Mark Sears, I think Sears is the better pull-up shooter in the mid-range. I think he's probably the more adept pick-and-roll player against drop coverage, but I think Walter Clayton Jr. is a little bit more dynamic with the ball in his hands in isolation, and I think he can be a more valuable off-ball player than Mark Sears because he's a bit bigger, and I think defensively will hold up a little bit better as well. Not that Walter Clayton Jr. is an elite defender or anything, but I think he, just with his slightly bigger frame and size, is going to hold up a bit better than Mark Sears there. I think these two guys are a real coin flip. For me, they're very close together on my board at this point, and I think going forward, I mean, I'm still huge on Mark Sears. I'm a big believer in that train, but I do think Walter Clayton Jr. will have a little bit more opportunity because I expect him to be drafted about 15, 20 spots higher than Mark Sears will be. And as a result of that, coaches, GMs, they'll put a little bit more trust in him at that spot as well, just given it's a slightly bigger investment for a team to make. 23, I have Ben Saraf, a player who I continue to be relatively high on. Now, I know in my mock drafts recently he has slid a little bit further down the board, and I always get comments about that saying, why so low on Ben Saraf? I don't really think I am personally low on Saraf. I think there's a real good NBA player in here, someone who I do think will stick in the NBA for quite a while because of his dribble pass shoot capabilities. You go back to his U18 film for Israel, you look at the film this year in Germany for Ratio Farmal. This is a good player. This is a guy in the Euro Cup that has been the go-to guy, the primary creator of offense, running a ton of middle ball screens and creating. And he's been one of the biggest benefactors of stock improvements for a guy like Noah Senge, who we're going to talk about later. Noah Senge lives off of Ben Saraf's creation for the most part. Now, obviously, some of it comes in transition or off of other players, and every once in a while, Senge has his own self-creation tools. Not very often, but sometimes. And I think Saraf at 23 here for me, I think it really all stems from how you view him. And I think this is going to be one of the tricky things. If I was his coach, I'd put the ball in his hands. But once you get to the NBA, there's so many good players. There's so many guys who can already create, and you already have that kind of scheme in the NBA where this guy's going to have the ball, everyone else got to play off of him. It's not to the highest extent it's ever been in NBA history, but it's at a very high level right now. The heliocentrism is very, very high. And a guy like Ben Saraf, who's talented and skilled, might not get to be maximized playing off of somebody else because he's not an A-plus level shooter. I think he's going to be a respectable shooter in the NBA. I think concerns about his three-point shot are a little overblown. But I do think there is just going to be some limitations in terms of the opportunity that he has, maybe compared to what he's even warranting, because at his size, teams are going to label him as a shooting guard, but for the most part, he's played point guard. For Israel, played point guard. For Ratio Farm has played point guard. So I think that's going to be a little bit of a hang-up early in his NBA career. We'll see what the opportunity looks like, though. I definitely think he can return starter value for a team. But again, it might come down to that opportunity, team context, situation, and how much he actually gets to play with the basketball to maximize his dribble, pass, shoot skills at the NBA level. Moving up to the 22 through 20 range, and Koby Brea shoots up a few more spots on my board. I've just sat and thought about it and kind of lingered on my last board, and I thought to myself, I'm really high on Koby Brea. I think he's a really good player. I think he's extremely functional into a half-court offense. Why would I have him as low as I do? I think this guy is going to be a 10-year NBA player. He's an elite shooter, someone who in the A-10 stood out in a big way for Dayton, transfers into the SEC to play for Kentucky, and really solidifies everything that I had already believed and seen him do. It just kind of furthers my belief in him as a player. Measured in quite well at the combine, now did measure in with a negative wingspan, which some teams will be a little concerned about. I really don't think it's too big of a deal. We've seen elite shooters in the past, like JJ Redick, for example, measure in with a negative wingspan. I don't think it's the end of the world at all. It probably does put a little bit of limitation on his ceiling. But as you can see here, for me, I think his ceiling and floor are very bunched together tight. He's a fifth starter type in an NBA offense, or an off-the-bench go-to shooter who you can draw plays for, have him run off of screens, shoot off of movement. He's very, very good off of dribble handoffs. I think pointing back to his time with DaRon Holmes II at Dayton is a very good place to start. So if you're looking at potential fits for him, he could be tremendous in Sacramento off of Sabonis. He could be great in Houston off of Şengün. He could be brilliant in Denver off of Koby Brea. The Nuggets badly need more three-point shooting volume and good three-point shooters, especially if MPJ maybe gets moved this offseason. Koby Brea is a player who's going to fit like a glove wherever he goes. I think any team's looking for more three-point volume, which should be all 30 teams in the league, should be looking at this guy, and they should be strongly considering grabbing him. He's going to get drafted probably in the second round. I think it's going to be an elite steal for whoever picks him at that spot, and I have him at 22 on my board right now. 21 and 20. I kind of went back and forth here between Cedric Howard and Nique Clifford. I ultimately landed with Nique Clifford at number 20 and Howard just a spot below him at 21. I do think this realm is very similar to each other because I think Clifford and Coward can fulfill different roles in similar position groupings, right? Coward measured in great at the combine. He's a player who was not included in my last big board because I thought he was going to ultimately be playing at Duke. Now at this point, he's going to be keeping his name in the 2025 NBA draft. Very likely could be a top 20 pick in the draft. And at 21 on my big board, I think it's really well warranted. He measured in with a 7'2" wingspan, 6'5" without shoes on, so he's a big, long wing, and he can really shoot the basketball. That's really the track record on Cedric Howard. In his college career, he has been able to shoot the ball. In the 6 games he played for the Washington State program this past year, he shot over 40% from 3 and shot about 70% at the rim. Those are star role player numbers. If you have a role player in the NBA shooting over 60% at the rim and over 40% on threes, he becomes a star in that role. And I think for Cedric Howard, while there's some skill that I think people believe he can probably uncover with his handle and playing with his back to the basket a bit, doing some of the things he did at Washington State in his short tenure there. There's some interesting tools. For me, it's mostly about playing off the catch, taking open shots, playing in the flow of an offense, shooting the basketball when he's supposed to, swinging the rock when he's supposed to, and I think he can do a lot of those things. For me, with some of my concern, even though he has great physical tools, I think the attention to detail defensively and the defensive impact is still somewhat of a question mark for me going forward. So his floor a little bit lower than Nique Clifford. I think Nique Clifford coming into his draft class is going to be a very, very safe option for a team. Now, some people think he should be a top 10 pick, a lottery pick in this draft. I'm a little bit more hesitant on that. I think Nique Clifford, a very good player. I also think there's the benefit of being a significantly older prospect playing against college competition for Colorado State. Like, he's not in the SEC. He's not 20 years old. And then people, I've seen tweets saying, well, if Nique Clifford was 20 years old, he'd be a top 10 pick. Yeah, well, when Nique Clifford was 20 years old in college, he was not playing a lot for Colorado. So that's kind of the reason behind it. I would hope at 23 years old, he's a bit better than he was at 20. And that's exactly the case here now for him. And it's not to diminish what he is. He's a very well-rounded player. He's a guy that I could see a team like OKC or Orlando snagging and being very, very happy with the early immediate results because he is a two-way wing who can guard up and down the lineup a little bit. Very talented shooter, can shoot off the dribble. One of the biggest growth areas for him in the last couple of years has been that three-point shot and the stability of it. Nique Clifford is an intriguing prospect, one who's going to return pretty good value overall, in my opinion, as kind of a fringe starter, fill into the lineup when you need him to. But worst case, he's coming off the bench and able to create his own shot a little bit, create for others, something he did a bit at Colorado State too. He's just a well-rounded all-around wing. Now, we have seen other prospects who are a little bit older kind of come in with this same mantra of being able to do a little bit of everything for a team. You think back to Wendell Moore. You think back to Chris Duarte, two guys who were both first-round picks. As older prospect wings, I think Nique Clifford a little bit more physically gifted than either of those two guys, though. And I think just a little bit more talented than both of them. And I think that's one of the big separators why I'm still confident having him in my top 20 at this point. Even though, again, I'm not the highest on Nique Clifford, I think there is some value there for a team to work with at the very least. Moving up to number 19, I have Drake Powell, another player who I was not sure was going to stay in the 2025 NBA draft, but after measuring in very, very well at the Combine, I think impressed a lot of people at the Combine. I do have him ultimately now featured on my top 30 big board at number 19. He was a guy who was yet to be determined if I was going to list him or not last time, and I put him at 19 here. I think the point of attack defense, there's so many physical gifts for Powell to work with, and it showcased itself throughout the entire year. You're talking about snatch blocks, you're talking about chase downs, you're talking about getting in the passing lanes, hedging and recovering when his guy was screening, and then also at the point of attack, very good screen navigation tools. I think the name of the game for Drake Powell, if you're willing to draft him in the first round this year, is because you view him as a very, very good defensive prospect and someone who can be a very impactful perimeter defender for your team defense. And I think that's what Powell can be, because there's more value than just, hey, put him on the ball, have him make the other guy work. You look at the value that Aaron Nesmith has brought to the Indiana Pacers in this Eastern Conference Finals against Jalen Brunson, for example, in the defensive side. Like, obviously, Drake Powell is going to bring you some of that when it comes to the screen nav, the quickness, the ability to be a bigger forward wing type who can stay in front of guards and has the foot speed to do so. But then the physical gifts in terms of the athletic bounce, the shot blocking timing that he has, that's where you get extra value defensively by filling in gaps and being a low man helper at times and opportunistic as a transition defender. Those are like all the little small things where you might not look at them and say, well, it's super imperative that our wing can block a shot here and there, but it does win you possessions. And basketball will always be a possession game. The more possessions you can take away from the opponent, the more possessions you can create for yourself, the better. Drake Powell has the physical gifts to create those advantages for you throughout the course of a game. While it might be, hey, one steal here, one block there, one offensive rebound here, it doesn't sound like a huge deal, but over the course of 48 minutes, every single little possession matters, and I think Drake Powell is going to be a possession winner in the NBA, and I think there's a lot of value there. His floor, I think, is relatively safe because of his defensive upside. And then really, again, that starter upside, again, is predicated on his defensive capabilities. I don't think there's going to be a ton of off the dribble creation for him going forward, but he shot the ball well enough this year to be a respectable off-ball player in the NBA, whether you just have him standing in the corner or, spacing off the wing a bit and then acting as a cutter from there with some of his physical tools. There's functionality here, and Drake Powell flat out can guard, and I think there's a lot of value right now in the NBA. You're seeing how imperative it is to have good point of attack defenders and a litany of them. Drake Powell is going to be a contributor in that way in the league for sure. Now we get into 18 and 17, and I still have kind of the same dilemma I had in my last big board with Asa Newell and Danny Wolf side by side. I cannot really decide which one of these two I want to have higher because they're very different prospects. Both of them very skilled and both of them talented in different ways. Asa Newell, a little bit more defensively versatile, obviously has very good lateral mobility, foot speed skills for a big man, can move his feet quite well, and then offensively, he has an emerging touch, gets to that push shot, gets to that baby hook shot quite a bit as well, something he did quite a bit for the Bulldogs. And then he gets on the offensive glass, averaged over 3 offensive rebounds per game. And I think if you're trying to sell yourself on Asa Newell, I just got done talking about the possession battle and how Drake Powell can help you win possessions. Well, 3 offensive rebounds per game doesn't hurt either. Asa Newell was an elite offensive rebounder, and I think, honestly, the more I'm talking about this, the more I'm selling myself on that Asa Newell stock, and maybe he should be above Danny Wolf in this video. I think the two of them are very close, though, because Wolf is more of that traditionally dribble, pass, shoot skilled player, and he does it at nearly 7 feet tall, which is what makes him so unique and impressive in this draft class. At Michigan, I think was overtaxed with being a primary creator of offense, and in the NBA, teams aren't going to run their offense through Danny Wolf. Okay, he's not Alperen Şengün. He's not going to be a 1A option for a team, and that actually probably helps his value here because you can use him as a short roller. You can use him as a creator against mismatches. You can post him up against smaller fours. You can maybe spread him out if he's playing the 5 against a bigger, slower-footed big man. There's some real value here. I think he can fit in a variety of team contexts. I think there's a lot of dribble handoff value that you could probably pull out of Danny Wolf that Michigan didn't quite utilize as much under Dusty May. And with Wolf's ability to play with another big, we saw how dominant he was with Vlad Golden there for the Wolverines this past season. I think Danny Wolf specifically at 17 still is very predicated on his overall skill set, his ability to knock down perimeter shots as well, which right now he hasn't been the most reliable results-based shooter. With how much he was tasked to create for Michigan's offense, I think slating him down, kind of lessening his load and usage going forward will help him quite a bit in terms of the efficiency and the play finishing skills that he does have as a touch big man who can shoot the ball a bit, put the ball on the deck, play out of delay action, play off the top of the key, hopefully trigger into more dribble handoffs and create offense in a more sustainable, easier way than what he was asked to do for Dusty May and the Wolverines this past year. Moving into the top 16, and this little bunching right here I think is a fun one to talk about. You look at Carter Bryant, Jase Richardson, and Rasheer Fleming. Rasheer Fleming, for me, very low ceiling player when all things are considered offensively. I just don't see him being an elite offensive player at any point in time. I think he can be an okay contributor offensively by being a sole play finisher. I don't trust him putting the ball on the deck. I don't trust him creating for himself ever. I definitely don't trust him creating offense for others off the dribble as a drive and kick player ever. I just don't think, even in the A10 this past year for St. Joseph's, he was just not good at it. And that was against, again, pretty inferior competition compared to what he's going to be facing in the NBA. So, how do I still have Rasheer Fleming at 16? Well, he's huge. He can rebound, and he can finish plays, and he can defend. And those things are, again, extremely valuable with the heliocentric version of today's NBA, with how star-driven the sport has become. You need players around those stars that accentuate their talents and can make plays off of that, and then also guard the other team's stars. And I think Rasheer Fleming measured in a bit bigger than Tari Eason even. Now, I don't think he's quite as physically gifted as Tari in terms of the jumping physical explosion tools, right? But Fleming, just measuring in huge, 7'5" wingspan, 6'9" without shoes on, Like, this is legitimately a 4 who can maybe play a bit of your small ball 5, has the foot speed to guard out on the perimeter, has the length and size to challenge around the rim very, very well and consistently, something he did a lot for St. Joseph's. And I think in an NBA context with more length, size, and speed around him than he had at St. Joseph's, you can really channel and harness some more of those point of attack defensive tools that he has as well. Again, he's a toolsy player. I think the measurements, the defensive versatility is really what you're drafting him for. And then it doesn't hurt that he shot the ball really well this past year for St. Joseph's. Now, again, a lot of that came on catch and shoot with pretty wide open opportunities. But in the NBA, those are the shots you're going to want him to take anyway. So even though, again, I'm very low on his overall ability to drive closeouts and get to the basket on his own, I think there's enough functionality here as a cutter, as a shooter off the basketball, that he's going to be survivable offensively and very impactful in the other areas like rebounding, team defense, point of attack defense. I just think there's so much value here to uncover for a team. And when it comes to landing spots, you look at like a team like San Antonio at 14, the Thunder at 15, I think make a lot of sense. The Magic at 16, another team that makes a ton of sense. And then you look at someone like Washington at 18, maybe even Minnesota at 17. That kind of little range there from 14 to 18 all seem like great possible landing spots for Rasheer Fleming, for teams that are trying to build elite defenses, for teams that are trying to buff up their front court quite a bit long term. I think Fleming fits into a variety of those destinations extremely easily and well. Jase Richardson at 15. Dribble, pass, shoot prospect. I think right now the questions really stem from his overall size and height. Now, he measured him with a 6'5" plus wingspan. That wingspan, I think, is going to be very valuable in maintaining some of his draft stock. If he measured in a little bit smaller with a slightly more negative wingspan, or a slightly smaller wingspan, there would have been even more concerns and questions about his height, where he measured in without shoes on at 6 foot flat and a ½ inch extra. I mean, it wasn't surprising to me. If you watch Michigan State this year, he's smaller guard. He is a kind of off-ball combo guard who can do a little bit with the ball in his hands. But one of the things that Jase Richardson's really good at, and I want to call out in this video, he's one of the best off-ball screen users in this draft, because he's not just the, oh, well, I'm going to sprint out to the three-point line, catch and shoot it. He's reading where his man is going. He's got a very good natural feel for when to curl off screens, when to get to the rim off of those, catch and go. Just a very good instinct player, and it's not surprising when he would have, his dad played in the NBA for as long as he did, Jason Richardson. Jase is a good player. Jase is someone who knows what he's doing on the basketball court, and he's been shorter his whole life. He's not just all of a sudden shrunk and became a shorter player in the NBA. While yes, size is super important in the league, length is obviously a very prevalent thing to view as well. I do think Jase Richardson's overall collection of skills and tools will outweigh some of the concerns. At the end of the day, the best players in the sport are the guys who are the most talented. At number 14, I do have Carter Bryant, someone who I think has a little bit more juice in his game than Rasheer Fleming. Now, wasn't nearly as productive as Rasheer Fleming, but playing for Arizona this past year really didn't need to be. Of course, had a lot of other talent around him. Arizona had quite a few good players and guys who are probably going to be prevalent watches in the 2026 NBA draft as well. But Carter Bryant, for me, someone who is extremely low usage, just a 16% usage rate, very similar to Khaman Maluach in terms of usage. And that's somewhat atypical for a college wing to have college center usage, especially John Shire college center usage is pretty incredible. But I don't think a lot of executives or GMs or teams are fooled by that. And they're not looking at that as a huge negative. In fact, I think it's a very easy thing to view as a positive. He's going to step into the NBA, and he's going to do two things. He's going to guard, and he's going to play off the basketball. And again, with the heliocentrism of the NBA, and I keep mentioning that, and you might be getting tired of it, the reason I continue harping on that, draft philosophy is essential. And you need to know exactly what you're trying to draft for. Are you drafting track and field athletes, or are you drafting basketball players? Are you drafting guys who can all put the ball on the deck and shoot mid-range jump shots? Or are you drafting to win games in 2025? If you're doing that latter part, if you're drafting NBA players, good basketball players who can play off of each other, fit around other talent, and win you a lot of games in 2025, you need a balanced roster with players who are comfortable playing without the ball, comfortable cutting off the baseline, comfortable finishing above the rim, and comfortable defending the other team's best player. Carter Bryant is going to be able to check all of those boxes. He's extremely athletic. He's got a big frame, and he's able to utilize it well defensively. And I think when it comes to Bryant's NBA career, he's going to be extremely impactful as a cutter, someone who's going to be able to be useful against zones if you want to play out of the middle of the floor. He's going to be a very good dunker spot occupier if you're trying to spam short rolls with a big man. You know, again, a team I keep talking about, San Antonio at pick number 14. There's a variety of prospects in this draft who, if they land with the Spurs next to Harper and Fox and Wemby, are going to be in a great spot long term. Carter Bryant ranked at number 14. This is going to be a prospect who delivers near lottery value in this year's draft, and I think is going to be able to be a very impactful fit contributor on a team that already has existing talent, and I'm excited to see where he ultimately goes on draft night. Moving into that 13 through 11 range, this is where we have some real variance on who's going where and what that value looks like. Noah Senge, for me, someone who has moved down a couple spots from my last big board down to number 13. I just still have questions about the three-point shot. Hasn't shot the ball super consistently well this year for Ratio Farm and has exclusively played as a play finisher. Again, I referenced it earlier, talking about Ben Saraf. Noah Senge is a good transition player, a very impactful finisher at the rim, drives closeouts pretty well, but there's not a lot more to his game other than straight line drives, catch and dunk, catch and finish, catch and shoot. And, well, again, in the NBA that fits, which is why I still have him in the top 13 here. It does, I think, paint a question for his long-term upside. For me, I do think there is some high-quality starter upside to get to. He's the first player up to this point in the big board to have that high-quality starter upside. And I do think specifically for Senge, that's going to stem from the defensive end of the floor and his ability to be an impactful defender, fill in the gaps well. And that's where the fluidity with his athletic gifts makes him a very special long-term defender, possibly in the NBA. Again, I think there's going to be some significant room for growth in that area when it comes to the attention to detail and focus and the scouting reports. But he's been impactful in a pro league, making plays out on the perimeter, being somewhat of a shot blocker. He's been in the passing lanes a ton, ranks in the top 10 in the Euro Cup in steals per game right now for Ratio Farm Ulm. They've been a good team this year. And Senge has obviously been at the center of it. He's had some huge showings where if things are going right, if the offense is creating the advantages they need to, Senge can be a very high-level play finisher, and I think that's where you're going to uncover most of his value in the NBA. Now, I do have questions about his functional play strength and playing into traffic, playing into rim protection, and how, with his very skinny, thin frame, is going to have some real limiting challenges because of that. And my concern is, well, you might say, well, he could just get stronger, put on weight. My question is it similar to a Mo Bamba situation where when Mo Bamba came out of Texas, what made him so special at his size was how quick he was and mobile and fluid. And then for Orlando, he bulked up, got way stronger, and lost a lot of that mobility and that explosiveness and that juice out on the perimeter. So if Senge puts on a bunch of weight and gets stronger, do you lessen and dampen how special of an athlete he can be from the fluidity standpoint out on the outside of the arc and the perimeter element of the game? So I do think in a league where covering space is essential, Senge has so much value for a team in that regard, and I think that's really what's going to hold him in the top 14 on my big board throughout the rest of this draft cycle. At 12, I have Ace Bailey. This is, again, one of the hot button topics. Last time, a lot of people questioned me, saying, how do you not have all-star upside for Ace Bailey? It's very simple. He's not very good at handling the basketball. You look at most of the all-stars in the NBA, they're all very, very good at getting to spots, creating for themselves, and putting the ball on the deck and scoring. And Ace Bailey just frankly isn't good at that right now. He's more similar to Michael Porter Jr. for me than he is to Kevin Durant. And you know, people look at Kevin Durant, they talk about his height, shooting over the top of people. What they don't talk about is the pull-up threes with the hang dribble. They don't talk about the crossover. They don't talk about the between the legs. They don't talk about all the stuff that allows him to get to spots to do those things where he shoots over the top of guys. Ace Bailey, there is some significant skill to work with here, and I still do have some high-quality starter upside for him, and I think a lot of that spans from some of his two-way potential and functional athletic gifts that he can utilize when it comes to getting on the offensive glass, being a very good wing rebounder, which I think is extremely valuable in the league today with the possession battle and spacing. If you can crash from the corner and rebound the basketball, it just saves possessions for teams. Ace Bailey's going to be good at that. And then also defensively, even though there's a lot of lapses in focus right now and Just mentally, I mean, he's an 18, 19-year-old player. Like, that's what you're going to expect. These kids are going to make mistakes. They're not going to have the scheme perfectly dialed in. That's standard, okay? I'm not trying to harp on Ace Bailey's negatives here. What I am trying to talk about is his positive strengths of, hey, when he does get out of position, he has the athletic gifts to make up for it. It showed up in his high school film a lot as a shot blocker, weak side rejections, time after time, chase down blocks, which were always fun to see. And at Rutgers, we got to see flashes of that as well. Now, he never really put it all together for the Scarlet Knights, just did not have a very good freshman season, all things considered. Wasn't the most effective, efficient player, but there's definitely value here for a team, and I do think if he does grow his handle and get a little bit stronger, a little bit better footwork, maybe he does at some point reach that all-star upside. Now, I'm a little unsure of that. I'm kind of betting against that at this point, but I do think very, very safely Ace Bailey is going to be a long-term starter in the NBA. I'd be very shocked if he really isn't because of his collection of physical gifts, shot-making talent, the ability to shoot over the top of guys off the catch. And again, if he does grow in that one dribble pull-up area, that two dribble pull-up area, maybe he can be even a little bit better than I have here on my big board. Then the real big boomer bust prospect for me in this draft is Jeremiah Fears, who I have ranked at number 11. For me, I think at the very minimum, he will be a six-man type of player. His handle is way too electric to not warrant minutes off the bench in the NBA. He can get to spots. He can get downhill. He's extremely quick, very explosive first step. One of my favorite things to watch about Jeremiah Fears is his creativity with the ball in his hands. And I think that alone gives him a very, very safe floor. If you're drafting him in the top 10, well, yes, it might not be sexy to draft a sixth man there. That might be the worst case outcome that you get. And the upside here is maybe more so along the lines of a Kemba Walker. I do look at Jeremiah Fears as a slightly bigger Kemba Walker when it comes to the handle, the creativity, the three-point success rate, especially early in Kemba's UConn career. If you compare some of Fears' numbers to Kemba Walker's college career, they're not far off from each other. Now, I do think Fears is a little bit more advanced as a playmaking passer in the pick and roll at this point, but I do think, unlike Kemba, I think Fears is going to struggle a little bit more when it comes to actually getting all the way to the rim and finishing at the rim around traffic. Kemba was always so creative, and then obviously had that kind of mid-range step back to always go to as his counter to that. Fears doesn't shoot a ton of those mid-range step backs. Of course, the game has evolved and changed. Fears is going to shoot more dribble pull-up threes than we ever saw Kemba really do. So, I mean, that's where you're going to have the differences in era, right, between the two players. And now I'm starting to sound old because I'm talking about Kemba Walker in a different era, and it's aging me a little bit. But I do think with Fears here at number 11, he has significant upside. And he's a guy that if you told me 5 years from now that he's made 2 All-Star games and that I was way wrong and should have had him in the top 5 on my board, I would say, yeah, I mean, that's a real possibility. I find myself kind of in that starter tier with him, maybe a little bit into the high quality starter tier, where I think the realistic outcomes for him is he's a starting point guard in the NBA. He creates off the dribble, but is he good enough to win playoff series through with the volume he's going to have the ball in his hands? You know, is an NBA team going to give him that leash that he had at Oklahoma to be the go-to guy? Now, if you're a believer that age equals potential, which I'm not, I don't think the youngest players are always the highest upside guys. But Jeremiah Fears, very, very young as well. He reclassified up. So if you're trying to bet long-term that Jeremiah Fears has more room to grow, can become a better shooter, he shot the ball very well at the Combine, which I think helped his stock quite a bit as well. This is a guy who's going to be drafted in the top 6 or 7 picks this year, and very, very well could justify that selection. So, again, I don't want to come across like I'm way too low on Jeremiah Fears. I just have other preferences in this draft class who I think maybe could be more impactful in a team context than Fears. But the upside is very, very immense here, and the floor is honestly quite respectable, all things considered. But again, if you draft a 6-man in the top 10, it's not a great pick, but and I'm not saying Fears will be a 6-man. I think he'll probably be a starting level point guard, but I'm just saying, like, this is a real boomer bust risk, in my opinion, with his play style. Number 10, I have Adou Thiero out of Arkansas. Moves up a couple spots on my big board in this video. And this is another guy who I think has real star potential upside. And this is a player who, first couple of years at Kentucky, was not getting on the floor a ton, but when he did, made things happen. His event creation rate was insane first couple years for the Wildcats playing under Calipari. Then, of course, transferred to Arkansas with Calipari this past season, and then had a much bigger opportunity and really capitalized on that opportunity as well. Thiero had a great season for himself, averaged over 15 points per game, and was extremely productive as a cutter, slasher, play finisher, and he's one of the best athletes in this entire draft, whether it's him or Cooper Flagg. Those are really the biggest argument points in this draft for who's the best athlete. And I think Thiero, all things considered, is someone who's going to be able to get to the rim at will, whether it's off the ball as a cutter, something he did a lot out of the baseline and corner, sometimes even off the wing, playing off of Boogie Fland there for the Razorbacks, and then also did it quite a bit with the ball in his hands. He has a very fun first step for a wing, and then he is also able to generate a lot of explosiveness, whether it's off of 1 or 2 feet. I think there's a lot of similarities here to OG Anunoby. You know, Anunoby never really developed into that all-star caliber player like I think a lot of people had hoped, but for many years, Anunoby has been a very high-quality starter in the NBA, and I think Thiero has some of that similar growth and room to grow into with how big he is. His big, broad shoulders, wide frame, great vertical leaping ability, and his overall functional athleticism. Adou Thiero is a guy who I think has been completely overlooked for most of the process. Now, I know I'm not the only one on Thiero Island at this point in time, which I'm glad to see. More people should be in on him, and I have him at 10 on my big board at this point of the process. Number 9, I have VJ Edgecombe, and I'm actually going to go all the way up to number 6 because this is a pretty tight bunching here in this area. For me, VJ Edgecombe has the highest ceiling of this group from the 6 to 9 range, but he also has the significantly lowest floor, which might even sound surprising compared to Collin Murray-Boyles, who really cannot shoot the basketball at all. You might say, how does he have a higher floor or a lower floor than Collin Murray-Boyles, who struggles to shoot in an era where shooting is so important? For me, CMB is a very polished defensive prospect, and that's something that will get him on the court very frequently. Teams are going to love having him on their roster, and coaches will love playing him because he's a multiple effort, high IQ guy. And I really think this bunch here, outside of VJ Edgecombe, is a very smart, intuitive bunch when it comes to making plays. I'm talking about Knueppel, Jakucionis, and Murray-Boyles. And then Edgecombe, while he's not the most intuitive, instinctive player yet at this point in time, he's got the physical gifts to make up for it in a big way. And that's where, if he does develop in a big way, and this is, the dangerous comparisons for him are Anthony Edwards and Dwayne Wade, because he does have a similar body type and some similar physical bounce and athletic gifts. Now, I do think there's a pretty substantive difference between Anthony Edwards, Dwayne Wade, and Edgecombe in terms of actual talent. But if you do look back at Anthony Edwards as a draft prospect coming out of Georgia, there was a ton of three-point volume, not a ton of three-point makes. And that's an area where Anthony Edwards ascended his game and really grew as a prospect and grew as a young NBA player to leading the NBA in three-pointers made this past season, which is just incredible and a real testament to how hard he's worked on his game. Can Edgecombe have a similar growth trajectory? Now, I wouldn't bet on it, but if he does really improve his overall three-point shot making and his off-the-dribble scoring, he will definitely out-return top 9 value. He will be a top 4 or 5 player in this draft for sure if he grows significantly as a ball handler and shot maker. Those are my questions, though, is can he effectively do that? Because right now I kind of have him pigeonholed as this 2-guard who isn't going to be a lead guard in the NBA, isn't going to be an elite playmaker, but a pretty good one for his position, and has extreme physical gifts, but hasn't really put everything together yet. And I think Edgecombe's going to have some real problems there with polishing everything up. But if he does have higher upside than Knueppel, Jakucionis, Murray-Boyles for sure, just because of those physical tools. And you see it, there was plenty of plays this year for Baylor where you just go, oh my gosh. And he averaged over 2 steals a game, was productive in a lot of ways. So I don't want to diminish Edgecombe here at all. I just have this very tight bunching here between these guys. Honestly, about 2 days before I'm recording this, I was thinking about having Edgecombe at 7 and moving Jakucionis and Murray-Boyles both down 1. And then I thought about it more. I'm like, I trust the instincts. I trust the IQ, the intelligence of Jakucionis and Murray-Boyles a little bit more than I do Edgecombe from a positioning standpoint and offensively. Like, I think there's just things that Jakucionis can do when it comes to passing the ball that Edgecombe just can't at this point. So it's a hard kind of double-edged sword here for me because I'm going back and forth on this grouping a lot, and I hope you can see that in the way the board is constructed. For me, I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about Kon Knueppel at number 6. People are going to be a little outraged by that, I'm sure. Now, not everyone. There's a good amount of Kon Knueppel faithful, which I love to see because he is a very good player. I'm going to zoom in here on this this top 6 to 9 range. Kon Knueppel for me at 6, I think, is extremely warranted because he's just super decisive, and he's just flat out very good at basketball. This kid can really shoot. He can catch, play off the catch extremely well, understands rip-throughs, understands how to get feet to the paint. He can garner attention by drawing double teams running off of screens or catching and going. I just think there's so much offensive value here, and I think defensively he's athletic enough to hold up quite well to the point where you're not going to just bleed points with him on the court. And I think for someone who's this good of an offensive prospect, as long as he's not a complete nothing on defense, you're going to be pretty happy with the results. And for me, Kon Knueppel, I just trust the processing. I trust the IQ. I trust the intelligence. I trust the shot making, especially. I trust the shooting. And I trust the fact that he's going to get to 2 feet. He's going to be rather turnover averse. Jakucionis, he's not turnover averse at all. But what he's going to do is put pressure on team defenses with his passing and get your team to advantageous situations pretty frequently, and he's comfortable shooting the ball at a high clip. He wants to shoot threes. He shoots them decently well, and I think, again, at Illinois, was probably a little overtaxed with having to do too much. So you put him into an NBA offense where he's maybe the second guy or third creator for a team instead of just the sole primary go-to player for the most part, you're going to get better results. You're going to probably get a lower turnover rate and maybe even a better assist rate when it comes to maximizing his effectiveness and usage in the league. CMB, again, it all comes down to multiple efforts, rebounding, positioning, IQ, and effort. And I think CMB is going to be an awesome player in the league because of those things. So right now I do have Edgecombe at 9. Again, I'm a little wary of that. This is going to be one of the biggest bunched areas that you guys have to watch for when it comes to the end of the cycle with my final big board, which will be out in a little bit less than a month now. We're a little bit less than a month away from the NBA draft, which is scary. But I'm so excited for it. Let's get into that top 5 now, though. And the top 5 is going to look very similar to what it did last time. There has been no movement in my top 5. In fact, and we'll just show off the whole thing here in the top 5. And you'll see where I have everybody specifically. And when it comes to the tiers, you're noticing that Cooper Flagg for me has an All-NBA floor. And Dylan Harper has a Hall of Fame ceiling. Derik Queen has an All-NBA ceiling. And Khaman Maluach, while he may never be an all-star, and I think that's very important to say, and I want to make sure you guys hear that, I don't think Derik Queen Khaman Maluach will probably ever make an all-star game. He won't have the counting stats to justify that, but he can bring back all-star value by being an all-defense team member, by maybe competing for Defensive Players of the Year, by being an elite rim protector, shot blocker, and rim deterrent. And I think that's where the value mostly lies for him defensively. Although at times for Duke, he did showcase the ability to switch out on the perimeter. Depending on what team he lands on in the lottery, maybe there's going to be another rim protector around him, and you can allow Maluach to guard out on the perimeter a little bit more, be a bit more aggressive, blitzing ball screens or hedging them aggressively, or just flat out switching at times, which would be quite fun to see on occasion too. Not something I think is going to be best for Maluach long term, but definitely something that I think is doable. And Maluach, I think the most underrated thing is screening. The better screens you set, the better your team's going to shoot, because they're going to come off screens open. You're going to be able to attack drop coverage. You're going to be able to attack switches, mismatches, this, that, and the other thing. Maluach sets great screens. That's where the value really lies offensively, as well as his rim finishing, the lob threat, rim gravity, all this stuff that we've talked about at length on the channel before. Derik Queen, Dylan Harper, I've got scouting reports on both these guys up on the channel. I like them both quite a bit. Cooper Flagg, I do want to spend just a minute of time here on. This guy's great. I'm very excited for him to be a Dallas Maverick. I think he's going to have a tremendous NBA career. Is he going to be better than Luka Doncic? No, I don't think so, but I think he's going to be very, very good. I think he'll be kind of in that Jason Tatum realm as a player, maybe a little bit more defensive oriented, maybe a little less talented with the ball in his hands, but I think all things considered, if Cooper Flagg continues working on his game and continues ascending the way that we've seen over the last 3-4 years as a prospect, there's a very good chance he just is a flat-out All-NBA guy by like year 2 of his career. He's going to be very, very good. I think year 1, he's going to probably not be an All-Star because rookies just barely ever make the All-Star team, but he might be an All-Star caliber player. And he'll definitely be an All-Star by year 2. I'd be pretty shocked if he isn't. He's just going to be a good player immediately in the NBA. And I think Dallas, they're not going to win a title with him right away. I would be very shocked by that if that happened. But I think they're going to be a very, very good playoff team immediately at the start of his career. And then Tre Johnson, another guy in the top 5 I do want to talk about a little bit. I think at the very bare minimum, he's a starting caliber player. I think the floor is very high for this kid. I think he can just flat out shoot the ball. He's got very respectable athletic gifts and good positional size as a 2-guard. He can shoot, and he's going to stay on the court, and he can play. He's, I think, very comparable to Tyler Herro in a lot of ways. That continues to be my favorite comparison for him because I just think the body type, the shot selection, the shot diet's very similar. And I think Tre Johnson, even compared to Tyler Herro, wants to shoot even more threes. So I think that's even a better green light for him going forward, which is what gives him maybe some more of that legitimate all-star upside to play into. Herro, of course, was a first-time all-star this past season for Miami. I think we got to the playoffs and saw that maybe there's a substantive difference between certain all-stars and others. But I do think Tre Johnson maybe makes an all-star team at some point in his career, but at the very worst can be an 18 to 22 point per game scorer pretty routinely and consistently, and doing so on okay efficiency. Is he an elite 1A build-around player? Probably not. But can he be, and I think that's predicated too on his lack of rim volume and lack of free throw drawing. Like, people hate grifters and free throws, but if you get to the free throw line, you're going to be a great offensive player and you're going to be very consistent. I think Tre Johnson's going to be missing that component from his game a little bit. That's going to probably hinder him from ever being an all-NBA guy. But I think all things considered here, he's still going to return good value. This has been my version 2.0 big board. Just a quick recap. We'll fly through the top 33. Again, Beringer, Traore, Raynaud, Sorber, Riley, Philon, McNeeley, Demin, Sears, Clayton Jr., Saraf, Brea, Coward, Clifford, Powell, Newell, Wolf, Fleming, Richardson, Bryant, Asenge, Bailey, Fears, Thiero, Edgecombe, Murray-Boyles, Jakucionis, Kon Knueppel, Johnson, Maluach, Queen, Harper, and of course, Flag at number 1. I hope you guys did enjoy. Again, if you did, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.